All right. Hey, everybody. We are so glad that you're here today with the Fully Alive by Disciples Made team. And as always, every month we get to tackle a theme. And this theme is this: key number 2 to thriving as a disciple maker includes clarifying and celebrating wins. And so this is what we will be focusing on the entire month of May 2025. And I am graced here with several members of the Disciples Made team, our founder and coaches and catalysts. And so we will be inviting you into a very important conversation today. And so we're also thankful for all of you who are participating as an audience member or listening to this on the podcast after the fact. But I want to just go ahead and welcome the team here today. And I'll go ahead and call on each of you to just give a quick introduction of who you are, your role. And so just to kind of get everybody acclimated with who is on the calls, we're just going to go around. I'll call on you. Brian, tell us who you are. Oh, yeah. How about that? Just tell us who you are.
I'm Brian.
And what is Brian?
Brian Phipps. I am a grandpa of 2, a husband of 1, and delighted to just be friends with you guys and so many other people who are multiplying disciples around the country and even around the world now. The Disciples Made story started with me in a car on the way home from a successful small group journey back in 2010 in the fall, and it's been a wonderful story that has cost me a lot and blessed me a lot. And I'm just very grateful that this is part of my life story. So,
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here with you. And let's go to Craig.
I'm Craig Watson. I'm from North Texas, the Dallas area, and Disciples Made changed my life. And I am just excited to be a part of this team that helps introduce that to other people so that their lives may also be changed. So excited to be here with you guys.
Thanks, Craig. Let's go to Tiffany.
Yeah, Tiffany Danley. I live here in KC, and I was first introduced to Disciples Made through Myra, who I was blessed to follow in her footsteps in congregational ministry as she mentored me and invited me to meet Brian Phipps. And so just excited to be along on the journey with you all and looking forward to this topic today.
Talk about a win. Having Myra Schraeder in your life is a win. So just going to call it right now.
True that.
True that.
Well, Myra, let's go to you.
I'm Myra Schraeder. I'm Women's Catalyst for Disciples Made. Totally blessed to be a part of this group. And I would say I'm the real winner in all of this because I get to work and play with all of you. And it is just a joy every day. So, I also have to confess that I am probably the world's worst celebrator. So I need what we're going to be talking about today. I'm very excited to be part of the conversation because
little therapy session for Myra. That's good. It's good.
That's great. And my name is Jason Phelps. I am on the Disciples Made team. I am a coach and then also handle the marketing and communications and will serve as host of today's webinar. And so it's an absolute joy to be with you guys and to see you. And even as a decentralized team, it's just great that we can be with each other via the interwebs. And so I want to go ahead and start off the conversation just with a bit of a foundational question. And that's Brian. I just want to throw it to you, man. Why is this key number 2 to thriving as a disciple maker, clarifying and celebrating wins?
I think it's Zig Ziglar who has the famous quote, "If you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time." And I think that when it comes to disciple making, any lack of clarity as to what a win is will result in ambiguous celebrations. Because it could be as poor as just we keep a bunch of Christian people distracted by a bunch of activities. I'm not saying that is the case, but it's like, well, how do we know that that's not what we're doing? Only by bringing clarity to what a win is in disciple making. And that needs to be biblical as well. So I think that we're suffering a lack of vitality and spiritual formation in people. And I believe that the primary culprit is a lack of this clarity. And then the secondary step we'll talk about is celebrating when people actually take those steps. And that's a giving thanks to Jesus celebration, not a self-puffing pride type of thing. I figure I might as well say that up front in case somebody's out there policing the call. We get that on occasion.
So with that in mind, let's go ahead and let's just jump into the first question.
Way to moderate that, Jason. That's good. Okay, you're gonna pass right by that. I mean, it happens, right? It's like that's not celebrating. We're actually just trying to make sure everybody gets stuff right instead of seeing the things that are happening well that honor Jesus and lifting them up. So anyway,
So how do we know if what we're doing is actually producing disciples and not just busier people? Who wants to jump in on that?
Nobody.
Well, Myra, what about you?
Okay. You know, if you know what you're looking for. So, what Brian talked about in terms of clarifying the wins, if you've got that, then you look for those things and just clarifying those wins and making sure those wins are in keeping with what God intends for us as disciple makers, disciple multipliers is so important. I was looking because I'll use this theme as part of our Women at the Well devotion tonight. I was looking at some scripture and I went back to when Jesus sent out the 72 and they came back and they were celebrating, they were rejoicing because they had authority over the demons, and Jesus very quick was rejoicing with them, but also quickly redirected them to what the real win was. And that was that their names were written in the book of heaven, and that they were bringing other people to that same place of having their names written in the books of heaven. So just reminded me of the critical importance of what we're aiming for and clearly communicating what it is we're aiming for. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's what's on my mind about this.
Well, I mean, I think kind of what Brian had said earlier is that if we just celebrate everything, then we're not going all the same direction, and maybe it's biblical and maybe it's not. And I know last month we talked a lot about, obedience is greater than competence and all that kind of stuff. And so, and we tie that into busyness. I remember that Tiffany had some great commentary just on sometimes we're so busy just doing good things that we're not doing the God things or the best things. And could it even be that, doing the good things is disobedience? Now that's kind of a weighty statement, but I think with that regard is, and maybe how we'll kind of transition the conversation and stuff would be that what is the difference between, like, should we be celebrating good things and not the great things? Or I mean, vice versa, and so I'd love for somebody just to kind of maybe share a story about, maybe accidentally celebrating the wrong things. Does anybody have any kind of
Well,
stories
I'll
about
tell
that?
a story. It won't exactly answer, the question that you're asking, but I think it gets to kind of the point and the heart of what we're talking about. And Myra, I can identify with you. I'm not, historically good at celebrating wins. I think that comes from a kind of an achievement background, and so doing well is just expected, and we don't celebrate what's expected. We celebrate what's extraordinary. And that's kind of my default. That's where I come from. But I found in the church world that we did a lot of celebrating, but it seemed some of those things seemed gratuitous. I mean, it just seemed, I mean, and it seemed like we celebrated in the wrong direction. We kind of, what were the qualifiers? Did we work hard? Were we busy? Did we have good intentions? Okay, well, what resulted in that? And we'll celebrate, that, because it must have been good if those were the inputs, right? But what I mean, celebrating the right win just completely redefined the direction that I was going, or the way, I was part of church staff, also a small group leader, and kind of from where I came from, reproducing disciples meant that you did that in a small group setting. And so it was very much like what I think a lot of people are familiar with. You're in a classroom, one person stands up in front of the group and they tell the group what they know about God or about scripture, or, or whatever it is that they have on their heart or mind. And there's very little interaction, although a small group setting is a little bit more, it's a little bit more friendly for that. Mostly, when I was that, it was me talking about what I know or what I've learned, and not a collective kind of engagement. But I thought we did. I mean, by all standards, we were doing small group very well. We were engaged in mission. We had good community. We had, I think overall pretty decent teaching. We were certainly biblically centered, right? We were we didn't do a lot of extra stuff. We focused on God's word, and then we also reached out. I mean, we reached out and invited other people into the group. But what I found over time were we making disciples? Was my efforts and the efforts of our collective efforts, were we truly making disciples? And what I found is we were adding to our number, but it was mainly people who were already believers, who already loved Jesus, and they just wanted better teaching or a better experience in small group, better community, or those kinds of things. So there were people from other small groups that came to our small group just because they preferred our small group. And what I found is over the course of years, if I was doing well, then I should be able to point to somebody. If I'm discipling this group of people, well, then this group of people should be discipling others as well. And I didn't find that to be true. Unintentionally, I was kind of creating an atmosphere that allowed me to use my giftings, but it didn't allow them to use theirs. And it didn't call them into this greater thing of making disciples themselves. And so identifying making disciples who make disciples as a ultimate win was something that made me really just redefine my whole focus in ministry. So story, I hope it answers a little bit, but I'll turn it over.
I've got a fantastic illustration, Craig. As you're talking, you're essentially talking about gradations of wins, right? So you made me think of baseball. Right now we're in full swing with baseball, Royals, fans here in Kansas City. And do people at the park cheer when a guy, like the pitch comes in and the batter, particularly a Royal, hits it? Like, yeah, there's a cheer. Is there a bigger cheer if that Royal gets on base after that hit? Absolutely. And the further around they get, the better. But is that the ultimate win, is just to hit the ball and get on base? No, I mean, the bigger win and the bigger cheer is when they actually get around and touch home plate without being tagged out. Like, that's the win. But in reality, it's not the ultimate win, right? It's, do they do that more times than the other team and actually win the game? And then I guess you could carry it on all the way out to the champion of the World Series. But I think what Myra postures here is a very fantastic question. If you just celebrate getting on base, you've missed the point of the big game. And what's the big game Jesus has called us to, is to make disciples to the ends of the earth. And so if we don't have a perspective on that, then we don't know what our incremental wins up to that point should be. And if we're not celebrating them, we're just taking all the potential momentum out of that could be there.
That's powerful. That's powerful. I think with everybody listening today, obviously, is that what we're all about at Disciples Made is just that, is that we want to see disciples who make disciples specifically through the lens of character and through the lens of calling that make a kingdom impact, that we get to see more of the realities on heaven happen here on earth. And so specifically, if you are a part of our Disciples Made extended family, is that the specific things that we are celebrating are the outcomes of character and calling. And so I'd love just to kind of talk about that, is that what does it look like for somebody, let's just say, who's making disciples, to celebrate character wins? What does that look like for you guys?
I'll go back to when I was in Kingdom Influencers and had a group of women, and we were very intentional periodically about measuring using the assessment, my impact assessment, to look at how we were doing with character and calling. And so we would talk about that when we did it as part of our habits to outcomes, and really look at goals that each person had set for themselves in terms of which of the fruit of the Spirit they wanted to grow in, and then talk about how we were doing with that. And we were just very intentional about looking at that periodically and then celebrating it when somebody said, hey, I'm seeing a real difference in that, but also looking for that in one another. So it was really important that we knew which of those fruit of the Spirit a person was working on, so that we would be in tune with observing when the Spirit was making changes. Because a lot of times for ourselves, we're not as aware of it as somebody maybe looking from the outside. So that was one of the things that we did to really intentionally identify when there was change taking place.
That's great. Does somebody want to speak to calling?
If you don't mind, can we go back to character for just a second?
Yeah.
So one of the practices, like as I'm hearing Myra talk about it, that I had so and still so like highly value is the fruit to root exercise that we learned in our missionaries made experience. And I think that it's so important because not only is it good for us to be able to say, okay, I recognize how it feels to have peace or joy, but I think it's also really valuable to be able to recognize when we don't have those things and they're replaced by things like anxiety and fear, and to be able to identify why we're feeling that way. Maybe is there some kind of lie that we're believing in about ourselves or about God, and that to be able to flesh that out and then to be able to rebuild that on God's promises so that we can then have that practice of taking anxiety and fear and turning it into joy and peace, or whatever, whatever the comparison might be.
That's
So good.
powerful. That's powerful. Yeah, I'm reminded of the quote that what gets celebrated gets done.
I've got
Right.
that written down. That was in the chamber, baby. Yes.
Right. Well, we can unload that one, because I think too is that if we're so busy celebrating the wrong things, we can't expect the right things to get done, right? And which is what you're saying, with the baseball analogy, and I think too is that I think just as humans is that we can just so easily get distracted, and which is the importance of having that clarity, not just celebrating wins, but clarifying and celebrating wins. And I think one of the key words that I use a lot when I'm able to talk about what we do at Disciples Made is it's moving from accidental to intentional.
Very much.
And that's the key, whether accidental parenting versus intentional parenting. I think we'd all choose intentional any day of the week, an accidental baseball player or an intentional baseball player. And the intentionality, my goodness, it brings purpose, it brings meaning, it brings focus, it brings transformation. And that's a lot of, what we talk about is that, we don't want to just settle for getting people connected. People need connection. People need community, but we're committed to moving that finish line and helping, everybody who's listening move the finish line to make and to multiply disciples, to equip the saints for ministry and to mobilize the priesthood of all believers. And if we don't clarify, then I think we get stuck in accidental everything.
And
Not saying it's
Jason, to
bad.
continue with that baseball metaphor, if a baseball team every inning loads the bases but doesn't get anybody in, they're going to lose the game. And I think that there's an awful lot of folks that measure the environment that people get in over the actual transformation metrics, for lack of a better term. We focus on those actual transformations of character and calling, like you've mentioned. But can you imagine just getting people on base every inning and no one scoring before the 3 outs, take them off the base? And it's like, I wonder how often we as church and our church systems get people into the groups. We got them on base. We got them interested. We got them in environments where they're ready to learn and grow and all this. And we actually don't measure anything beyond their connection. And I mean, it seems as if there's a very high potential without bringing clarity to actual the transformation, what it looks like. Then we could be leaving a lot of people on base over and over and over and over and over again. And how tragic would that be for the people that showed up to give their all to the game, but the coaches helped them not score?
So I can think of a situation specifically in my own learning process where that's concerned. We had this annual event that we had for our ministry to women where we would gather for Advent. And there was one year we were really excited about how many women had registered and the impact that we thought that was going to have. And so, of course, you want to celebrate when you reach record numbers. But what's crazy is then that following year was COVID. And we weren't able to meet all together. We were really excited about building on that number and increasing the impact. But then what happened was that event was forced into homes, into smaller settings. And the outcomes that came of that were so incredible. And while we had less in attendance, the outcomes were that much more impactful. And so it made me realize, that's where defining the win comes in. We had to go into that event saying, what is it that we want out of the end of this, rather than let's just, shoot for the stars and hope for as many people as possible. But it reminds me of that analogy of all those people left on base. What was the final outcome of that event versus the year that we ended up in homes and we had so many intimate conversations and outcomes that came of a very different approach and goal.
I hate to jump back in and capitalize. I promise I'll be quiet in a minute, but Tiffany's got the hairs on my arms standing up on end. It goes back, like Jason, when you asked me to introduce myself, I somehow went back to the origin story. But to make it really like palpable, based upon what Tiffany just said, Disciples Made's a thing because we had just doubled our small group system at Westside. We just added 1,000 people to small groups, and Jesus made me pull off the side of the road on my way home. And he basically said, that's not the win I brought you here to do. It's never been that clear to me, but basically I had determined to win, get more people in groups. It's a great thing. Some great things can happen. I'm not saying, get rid of that at all. It's just, that's just a means to a greater end. And it's a step in that process. But anyway, just the whole origin story of this entire ministry started with Jesus saying, you're aiming at the wrong win.
Yeah, one of the things that makes me think of, Brian, is and it came to me a while back, but if our plan to reach our community is through a building, then our building is too small. And if our plan is to fill our building, then our plan is too small. And it, because it just, there is no way we could saturate our community with the gospel just using our building alone. And it's minuscule in size to the, compared to the community at large. And so somehow there needed to be some other answer, some other equation that we needed to follow with something else on the other side of the equal sign besides fill a building or meet a number or have some kind of quota, whatever that is.
Brian, I think it was either you or Tiffany who just said the phrase something about getting in the game. And we had just made a social media post a couple weeks ago about getting in the game, get out of the pews and into the game. And I think that I'll say, if we want more people to get in the game, we have to be clear about what game we're inviting them to play, because otherwise I think of that the game that I think we can get stuck in is, or I don't know what you would call it, but I think there's two primary wins that a lot of churches have, and it's record attendance and record giving. And with those wins, what game is it? What would you call it? I wouldn't call it disciple making. And I think that if those are the wins, then anything we can do to just get more is what we're going to do. And I think that, I don't know if that's fair. I don't know if that's healthy. And because, it's almost gain record attendance at any cost and record giving. And so if we're asking people to get in the game, the more clear we can be, the better with those wins. Because I love the phrase that to be clear is to be kind. And the more clear we can be with wins as disciple makers, it will not only be kind to our team, it will also provide clarity and let us know for staff what direction we're headed. But then also too, with the influence, is that it will, if we're asking and recruiting people in a congregation to get in the game, we need to be even more clear with what it looks like to win when it comes to disciple making.
Yeah, and it's curious, what's the role of people in the attendance getting bigger or the budget getting bigger? Just being an individual contributor to that, maybe an inviter, but it certainly isn't hitting their potential. Right. So if that's the win, Jason, your comments really do illustrate this whole thing pretty powerfully. When I hear of record attendance at the church where I invest, that's really exciting. I feel like I'm a part of a winning team, and it's invigorating. It's great to know we're winning. Conversely, when they get up at the end of the year and say we're down 30% and we're going to miss our budget by 25%, that's a pretty big letdown. So we're going to, just talking about the impact, the emotional impact of winning and losing, just in general, really does bring some highlight to the importance of this conversation. You got to get the win clarified appropriately, and then be sure to celebrate it. So, yeah.
Well, I think that there are certain, you mentioned, or you bring up, Jason, those practical wins, those things that keep the doors open, right? I mean, you've got to have people and you've got to have money, otherwise the door's shut down, right? And so, but whenever you define a win solely by that, then you miss the mark. I mean, it's got to be part of the equation, otherwise we just stop functioning. But it's not it should be almost a byproduct of something bigger. And so if the win is making disciples who make disciples, who make disciples who make disciples, right? Then it seems like if we were truly able to multiply, then we wouldn't have an attendance problem and we wouldn't have a giving problem. And especially if we define disciples as someone who is growing in their character, growing in their calling, and helping other people do the same. So they're becoming more like Jesus over time, and they're having greater and greater impact because they're doing the things that Jesus created them to do. And not only just within their body, the believers that they're a part of, but in the community at large. I mean, that's just a win-win everywhere you look at it, right? And I don't know. I mean, I find it very difficult to imagine a church setting where that is happening effectively and they're still having problems meeting budget and they're still having problems with attendance.
Well, like
I agree,
Myra.
and
Oh, go ahead.
go
No,
ahead.
go ahead, Tiffany.
I was just going to say, I think that I love what Craig said, that it has to be a byproduct or some kind of symptomatic, like secondary outcome to the primary win. Just because I do think that it's possible that we could have record attendance and record giving, but have it really turn out more like the servant that went and buried their talent. And so we're just not using the things that we're given. And that can also be a device of the enemy that, yeah, I'll bless you with all these people that are just sitting in the pews unactivated and not doing the things that they've been shaped for. And so, that's why it's so important to have that primary win defined. And then we have that byproduct of the engagement of giving and attendance because they're on fire. And I also think that then you've got those people that are going to understand what it is they're supposed to do with the record giving. Or I think it also can be a situation where the budget does come up short, but everybody can faithfully say, they trust in God's plan and they see where God is going, and they've got that faith to get them over the gap of, okay, this is going to be a shortfall year, but we're going to make it work because we see what God's doing here and we're all in, and we're taking those next steps in faith, knowing that God's going to provide the things that we need, even though we don't see them immediately.
What I find is that as I continue to disciple folks and stuff through Leaders Made in this season, and even Missionaries Made, Followers Made, all of them, is that people, you can't expect to know that the average churchgoer, the average follower of Jesus, knows what the wins are supposed to be. And so I think that what the imagery that I'm getting in my head is like with my own kids, they're 10, 11, and almost 19. And that for me as a dad, I need to let them know what the wins are. And I think, don't want to overcomplicate it, but there's a good chance that my son is going to know he's winning when I tell him, And so I think that, in the same way, when it comes to our congregations and stuff, whether we're a church plant, prevailing model church, older church, younger church, all these kind of things, is that when we simply start celebrating things, people will catch on. And that I think too, is it doesn't necessarily have to be anything that is overly structured, but I think it's honestly just using our influence in the environments we've been given, whether somebody is not on staff and they're at an event or in the worship service and telling stories. I mean, I think telling stories is such a powerful way to celebrate the wins because people see themselves in stories. And so whether it's from the pulpit or whether it's a prayer in a worship service, the things we talk about in a positive way and just kind of highlight and elevate, I think that people tend to and just kind of like get introduced to a new norm. And so with all of that, I think that's just good news that that if we're not celebrating, just to start and to point it out. And sometimes I think it's in an IC&U conversation that it's like, hey, pull somebody aside, like, man, great job. Like I saw this in you and I just want to celebrate that with you. So they can be small. They can also be big win. And so I don't know, what do you guys think about that? Just kind of doesn't need to be over complicated, but we just need to start talking about the things that are worthwhile when it comes to disciple making and the mission that Jesus has for us.
I think if we're going to produce, Go ahead.
Go for it, Tiffany.
I think if we're going to make disciples who make disciples, we have to teach them how to celebrate wins so that they can go on then and celebrate the wins of those that they see around them. It's that producing what's inside of us to keep reproducing and multiplying. And so when we have those one-on-one conversations, or we have the public prayer service to celebrate the things that God has done, we're teaching others to do the same. And then it goes forward from that.
So, Jason, when you were talking,
Sorry, get it. Go, Myra.
a thought that I had, Jason, when you were talking about it is that just like we were made to worship, I think God made us to celebrate. And this comes from the person who's not a good celebrator, but we're made to celebrate things. So we're going to be talking about things, right? And like you said, those little things, but the things that we talk about, people are listening and they catch on to those things. So if we're not careful to celebrate the identified wins that we want to see, the disciple making wins, the transformation wins, but instead start focusing on other things or let the conversation go in those other directions, people are going to say, oh, well, that's what's important. It's not the character transformation. It's not the engagement in my calling. It's something else. And so I think what you said there is really important. We don't have to have the big celebrations all the time, but we need to be careful in the little things that we talk about and how we celebrate those things in the everyday conversations as well.
Well, and there's really room for, I think, multiple forms of celebration. I think that there are those celebrations that are shape and form culture kind of in a widespread way. So there are things that we celebrate as a larger group. But then there's also things that we celebrate, like you really led with, Myra, we celebrate almost individually, one-on-one, as a disciple maker with a disciple. And, those character wins, those things that, that Jesus helped them overcome that they struggled so much with before. That may not be really appropriate for a wide audience, but so meaningful in either a one-on-one or a small group setting. And so I think both are very important. I think both is, that we largely define our cultures by what we celebrate, what we define our wins as, and those incremental celebrations along the way that lead to those wins. But then individual disciple making is so much tied to just intimately knowing that person and realizing what it is that they're struggling with or where they're really trying to grow, and then helping them celebrate, point to those things. Because just like you also said, Myra, sometimes we're not the best judge of whether or not we've grown, right? And those movements are so incremental. It is so much easier sometimes for another person to be a witness to that rather than we be able to experience ourselves.
Craig, following up on that, man, I have found that cohort, small group size setting for this type of celebration is probably the most powerful I've seen. Another saying comes to mind to me. People are typically down on the things that they're not up on. And that it really does have I acknowledge that it kind of has a different application, but it applies here too. I don't know that I'm doing well or I'm progressing. And if I don't know that I'm progressing, I'm probably assuming that I'm regressing. But when one person says, here's what I've seen in you, that has a major encouragement effect. Dopamine is flowing. There's hope, there's inspiration. But when two or three others in the group hear that comment and then chime in and give specific examples of where they've seen it as well, that reinforces the actual win that person is trying for. And the encouragement is palpable in the room. And there's almost like this built-in desire to continue to demonstrate that growth in the individual once they receive that encouragement. And to me, a lot of people think, these cohorts for Disciples Made are the reading of the books and the processing of the books. You couldn't be farther from the truth. We actually weave those type of peer feedback sessions into every week of these cohorts. I mean, the book reading and processing is a piece of it, but it's just less than 25% of the pie when you include all these other things that actually fashion the transformation and secure it over time. So love those observations.
But one of the things, and sorry to jump in again before giving somebody else a turn, but what that makes me think of, Brian, is that we, if we're going to truly make disciples who make disciples, and if then we must be able to disciple others using the same methods that were used to disciple us, right? We've got to be able to reproduce whatever it was that created us. And going back to my example with the small group setting, what I found is that if my expectation was that the people who were in my small group were going to reproduce using the same methods that I was using when I thought I was making disciples out of them, well, then they were going to have their own small group. And so, I mean, very few of them, were really, that was what they were called to, or where they were gifted. And so I was not being helpful in creating an atmosphere and providing methods to disciple them that they were then able to turn around and use themselves to disciple others.
And we all know that they say, vision leaks. So I think continuing to celebrate is a good way of just continuing to drive that vision. Because if our goal is to help others to go out and bring people back in, we've got new people joining us all the time. And we have to, re-illustrate what a win looks like by celebrating it, turning it back to God and thanking him for the things that we've done, so that those that are new to the process can continue to see what it is that we're celebrating and aiming for as well.
Yeah, especially because I think, so many folks is that we're inviting them to be kingdom contributors for perhaps the first time, where they're used to, attending church, attending events, and maybe volunteering, either in a ministry consistently or not a lot. But then all of a sudden, when they are now being invited to actually make disciples themselves, I think there's a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation, a lot of uncertainty, because some of the guys that I'm working with now, they're strong leaders within their niche, within their vocation or their occupation. And so I think that through celebrating these wins, and Brian, you brought up just the peer feedback that we incorporate in the raise process throughout the cohorts, is that instills in that person that, okay, maybe I do have what it takes. And I think the more that we can celebrate those moments and give that peer feedback of just encouragement and affirmation, helps people see that, okay, I don't just know I was made for more now, is that I can actually see myself stepping into this role. And which ties in with, one of the phrases that I love to use when it comes to accountability, is that I often talk about it in terms of championing other people, that I will be your biggest champion, which means that I will help you win. I will celebrate the win with you and create that culture and DNA of clarifying and celebrating wins. It's very powerful, and it helps lift up those people that maybe don't see in themselves what we see in them.
For sure. Jason, I want to kind of hijack the conversation for a minute and go back, and because I think we're about to head to a different part of this conversation, which I'm excited for, but there's a picture from that baseball thing that really illustrates what Craig was talking about, and then you were talking about, what if I don't see myself in the role of actually facilitating a small group or facilitating a cohort? Like, those are obvious wins, but they're not the only wins. So let me go back to baseball. And this also goes back to that question of, how do we really, have a short list of what the wins are? Like, we've got character, we got calling, we got multiplying, we've got, disciples making disciples. So it's like, okay, well, how do we not let that list go crazy so that we're celebrating everything and nothing at the same time, because the list is too big? So when it comes to baseball, we celebrate the guys getting on base, but what are the things that they had to do to get on base? They had to practice batting, and they had to practice running. I'm not trying to be a baseball expert here, but they didn't get to that plate to stand in front of a pitcher because they just got lucky, or they got a ticket or a draft, they got drafted. They had to work hard at a couple of mechanics, and it's the mechanics of running and hitting and perhaps other things that actually have them qualified to stand there and make progress around the bases. And so when I look at character and calling, and then all these other things, to me, developing the fruit of the Spirit and developing my personal calling and joining Jesus in the Great Commission, those are the rudiments. You've got habits that help accomplish those things to get us on base, but how God takes us around that calling base in particular is so unique to the individual and their giftedness and their calling and their story and their situation in life. I mean, that's one of the most powerful things about the group feedback in a cohort, isn't just for people that will step up and lead their own cohort someday. It's, yes, you belong in that fight against sex trafficking, and you can bring leadership to that in this way and this way and this way. Or, yes, you definitely belong in feeding the homeless downtown because I've seen this, this, and this. Whatever that target is, it's the character and calling that unlock whatever it is. Just like batting and running is what unlocks the potential to be a part of a winning baseball team. It's the character and calling that fundamentally get people to the place where you can have meaningful understanding of what your next step in your calling is. And everyone on this call that's here in one of these windows has experienced that in dramatic ways and seen it in so many others. So I just wanted to tie that back. Why are character and calling the wins? Because those don't feel like they should be huge wins, but they are the fundamental wins that get people, to use your phrase, into that game.
Powerful. Powerful. For those listening, I would love to invite you just to kind of think of you if you have any questions, and we'll take some time here before we end to answer your specific questions. So feel free just to drop those in the chat. And so I want to make sure that two things. I want to make sure that we're really, really practical, and then also just time that, Brian, before we end today, if there's anything that you're like, man, Jason, we should have hit this, I want to give you time to do that. So how do we help those we're discipling? So it could be, our teams in the cohorts. How do we help them celebrate the real kingdom wins as they grow in character and calling? What does that look like, even if they're not flashy and fast? Because celebration, like we've talked about, it shapes culture. And we want to make sure that as somebody goes throughout their discipleship journey, there is going to hit a point where they get discouraged. And so I just love just some best practices and everything, just to kind of go around the circle here and just share just practical ways of how we can celebrate growth in character and calling and the impact that occurs.
I'll jump in. I like the idea. I'll add my little flavor to it that's been coming up several times. Never miss an opportunity to point out Jesus showing up in somebody. Just never miss an opportunity. If you see it, stop what you're doing, however busy it is. Say, I saw Jesus in you. Celebrate that win. It's not big. It's not flashy. But if you kind of approach life with that mindset of, I'm never going to fail to call out the goodness of Jesus I saw in somebody, that's a great little strategy. I want to leverage this. I almost never start a board meeting or a staff meeting or a coaches meeting without taking a perhaps significant amount of time celebrating wins. Now, the first time I did this was way back in 2009 or 10, when I was still in the church setting on the Next Steps team at Westside Family Church. We would start to celebrate wins because I was told by somebody in a podcast like this that what gets celebrated gets done, and that it's great for creating, a sense of everybody wants to be on a winning team, et cetera. All the things that we've said. So I heard all that, then I wanted to put it in place. So I know I've got, hour and 15 minutes with this team meeting, maybe 90 minutes. And we start celebrating wins, and there's energy around it, and there's excitement. And I'm watching the clock tick, and I'm feeling this tension of, I've got a list of this many things to get accomplished, and we're wasting all this time celebrating very clear wins. But I let it go because I want to test this thing, and kind of hoping that the listeners on this call will do the same thing. Well, let me just test this and see. So I watched that go. What was interesting is whatever gap in agenda was lost was more than 3 times made up for on the energy of the team as they left the room. Because the business could get done outside of that 90-minute meeting. But the energy of being together and celebrating what God has done was just rocket fuel for getting whatever agenda items in the meeting that needed to take place. I never consider celebrating wins to be a waste of time. I think it's a waste of a meeting to not take that gathered time to celebrate what God's doing.
Love that. Craig, what about you?
I mean, I think that part of that, ultimately, if you're in a position to mold culture and you to have an influence on that, then to do just like what Brian's talking about, to make that a part of just what you do. The men's group that I'm a part of, we call it Impact. And one of the first things that we do in our gathering is to talk about, I mean, you could call it celebrating wins, but it's basically, what did God do this week? And so, whether it be in a service project or whether it be in a small group setting that somebody had a breakthrough, or whether someone's, a prayer has been answered, whatever that is, we make a habit out of talking about those things. And then when we circle back, because a lot of times people don't necessarily know how to tie something to an objective. So they have a story. They've got this thing that they saw God do over the course of the week, and they want to talk about it, and it's incredible. But then being able to pull that back, because certainly there is some way to tie that back into character or calling. So you've got this great news, but seeing it through the filter of what it is that we're winning. So then you open it up for people to talk about those things. But as a leader, to help establish that culture, to be able to pull out those things that point back to the things that we're calling wins.
It's good.
Yeah. Tiffany, what about you?
I mean, I think a lot about I don't know why, but I keep thinking about like when we do our scripture interaction, we have the two questions about what is God doing, and what is he saying to me, and what does he want me to do with it? How am I to be changed? And I do think that there is an opportunity then in defining wins. And like Brian said, I think it's important to take that time and to celebrate them adequately. But then we don't stop there. It's what's next. Maybe it's, I'm going to use this to move forward and, take this next step. Maybe it's now it's time to rest. Maybe just to assess like what it is that's next after that win so that we continue that forward motion. And sometimes it's, Sabbath rest. Sometimes it's, the next thing we're called to. Sometimes it's just that consistent obedience, but to be able to reflect on that and to keep going in those wins so that we continue in the game and that forward progress.
Love it. Love it. What about you, Myra?
So I love that Brian pulled out, and I think Craig built on that idea of where does Jesus show up? I think it's really important to help people unwrap their impact in celebrating the wins, because I can often see somebody says, well, this happened and Jesus showed up here, but it's not a big deal. And to open that window to show that it's a much bigger deal than that person thinks about. Take them 1 or 2 steps down the road from that particular event and just celebrate the impact beyond themselves that God does as he moves us through our personal wins, that it becomes then wins for the greater kingdom.
Love it. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from all of this is just how important it is to make space. Make space for conversations, make space for the stories, and make sure that they're clarified through the lens of character and calling. Because as we talk about, character times calling equals impact. And if impact is the byproduct of what happens as we become more like Jesus in our character and as we live out our calling, impact's going to happen. And so if we can consistently point out the wins and the fruit of the Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit and the habits that support all those, is that impact's going to happen. And so I loved from y'all's input and stuff, just being able to always bring it back down through the lens of character and calling to ensure success and wins when it comes to the mission that Jesus has given us. Brian, any kind of last thoughts, anything that you would just love for our listeners to know and to be aware of and to kind of cling on to before we wrap up today?
Yeah. Thanks for that opportunity to share. A huge win is that I get to do this with y'all. Oh my gosh, I learned so much, and my heart's just encouraged every time we do this. So I hope it's the same for our listeners, but it's a huge win for me. Here's kind of what's forming in my mind. Every kingdom success / advancement is an opportunity to steward. And it'll either be stewarded poorly or properly. And that's a lot to take in. So it was for my head to get there anyway. So I don't know about just receiving that information. But if a kingdom win happens, if something meaningful, powerful, like the way Jesus intended, the impact for me in that equation, character times calling equals impact, is when heaven shows up on earth. That's the part of Jesus' Lord's Prayer. So when that happens, it's an opportunity to steward, and it'll either be stewarded properly or not, or poorly. And to do it properly requires 2 pieces simultaneously. And I think it's really important to bring this into focus, particularly as we wrap the conversation. It needs to be properly celebrated, and it needs to be done in the context of humility. Okay, so it's like we're pushing the celebration side. And I think quite appropriately so, because I don't know that enough of it's done. I don't know that there's enough impact of the right things to truly celebrate that make that happen. But regardless of the amount, it's like we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate the right things. But what we haven't brought really to the conversation is how do you do that in humility? And when I was hearing, I think it was Myra describing it, there's a tendency for us to downplay the wins in order to make sure we're getting the humble element in our lives. And I think if the humility is too high, Jesus isn't going to get the proper credit, and we're not going to see the proper motivation that naturally inspires us to continue to pursue those godly things. At the same time, if there's not enough humility, it looks like self-grandizement and self all the selfish and gross self-serving things. So it was just kind of helpful for me to think, in the cauldron of stewarding God's wins properly, it needs to be done. It needs to be done about the right things. And it needs to be done with just fundamental gratitude and deference to the grace of Jesus, making any and all of that possible to begin with. Without him, we are nothing, I hear or read in John chapter 15. But with him, we can do even greater things than he did. So let's get those things done. Let's properly and with gratitude celebrate them, and let's watch the culture of our of the wake. In the wake of what we do, let's watch that culture do this more and more properly, and therefore see the gains of it over time.
Makes me think of John the Baptist when he's like more of him and less of me, and often too, Brian, is your phrase, "Go God."
Yeah,
go God, right?
Yeah.
And so we can celebrate, we can give God the glory, and as we cheer and champion and one another
Amen.
on in the growth of character and calling. So,
Amen.
well, thank you all so much for chiming in, for listening in. We hope that this has been helpful for you to help you continue to thrive in your disciple making through clarifying and celebrating wins. We are with you. We are for you. And let's continue to have those ICNU conversations that spur one another on to disciple multiplication and as we live into the fully alive life that Jesus gives us. All right. Until next time.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Bye-bye.